If the crossbow was at a disadvantage in open battle, it was supremely suited to the castle-based hostilities so important to medieval warfare. With this statement, Hardy and Strickland, two of the main specialists on the issue, summarize an opinion held by many historians and history buffs, that the longbow is a war weapon, while the crossbow is a siege weapon. But is this actually the case? Some recent experiments raise questions about this claim, because if we look closely at the relevant literature, there is actually very little studies on how archers and crossbowmen were traditionally deployed in sieges. In particular, there are many unsolved questions about the practical and tactical use of crossbows. In a nutshell, the typical argument goes like this. The longbow was the better weapon for field fights, but it was at a disadvantage during sieges. Because the longbow is bigger and heavier, archers were less maneuverable in the constricted areas of a wall or a castle, and could not shoot as well through embrasures and battlements. Crossbowmen did not have these problems because their guns were much more compact. Also, a crossbow can be prepared, held loaded and shot quickly when an opportunity presents itself. Therefore, it is more suited for slow precision firing, which was especially vital in sieges. Moreover, the protection afforded by a fortification mitigated the crossbow's primary weakness, its long reload time. The only disadvantage of a crossbow in sieges was that the bolt could drop off the weapon as it was shot downwards. Did you see what fellow YouTuber Todd did there? He just held down the bolt with his thumb. This is presumably something that folks from the Middle Ages had already thought about. Thus, we can cross point 4 off the list. In the test you've just been shown, Todd and archer Joe Gibbs shot from the 80mm high Pope's Tower in Stanton Harcourt. In doing this, they produced several observations that put doubt on the standard justifications. Todd says the crossbow is considerably more practical to employ, but it's not the game-changing advantage that I thought crossbows might have in this situation. So we should definitely take a closer look at the issue. Now, before we analyze the traditional arguments in detail, we would want to mention 3 things. Firstly, we have already prepared a movie on the conventional longbow versus crossbow arguments, such as rate of firing, penetrating power, and training effort. Hence, we will solely consider items if they are clearly applicable here. Secondly, the question of whose weapon was better is a thought experiment, an intriguing one that can provide insight into how longbows and crossbows were utilized in sieges, but a thought experiment nonetheless. Obviously, both weapons were useful. They were both utilized in sieges and even commonly used at the same time. For example, siege towers were commonly manned with mixed teams of archers and crossbowmen. The kings of England and France viewed crossbowmen as a backbone of castle defense from 1154, or probably much earlier, and long into the 12th century. And even in Wales, the home of the longbow, crossbowmen were commonly used in sieges. For contemporaries, there is no such thing as a siege weapon or a war weapon. Thirdly, we are not specialists on crossbows and archery. We simply offer our opinions and ideas in this movie based on our historical background knowledge. Unlike the remainder of the longbow versus crossbow discussion, this video isn't concerning things of life and death, so don't take it too seriously and just put your recommendations and debates in the comments. Unwieldy longbow, handy crossbow. The most notable distinction between a field combat and a siege was that the archers almost always had cover during a siege. The defenders had walls, battlements, and arrow loops, and the assailants rarely ventured within range of a castle without mobile protection. For example, when Richard the Lionheart assaulted Nottingham Castle in 1194, he had his men take strong, wide, and broad shields. Many a man carried these in front of him till he came up to the gateway. They shielded themselves exceptionally well so that the crossbowmen did not damage them. This offered protection for archers and crossbowmen, but it also restricted their freedom of movement. At first look, it seems intuitively evident that the crossbow was more useful during sieges due to its small shape, which aided when passing through narrow passages or over slender walls and shooting through loopholes or battlements. Todd's test reveals that intuition is a poor guide in this scenario. He and Joe noticed that they were both extremely uncomfortable firing downhill, even though there is plenty of space atop Pope's Tower and the battlements are widely set aside. Overall, the longbow was a little unwieldier, but both had equal issues. At the end of the test, there was nothing remained of the crossbow's purported superiority. So I think that's probably where the advantage comes. I can keep up awkward shooting. Actually, that's probably where it is. I can keep up awkward shooting better than you can keep up awkward shooting. Maybe it's really as simple as that. The question is, of course, to what extent something can be generalized. The issue would undoubtedly have been extremely different in a castle with loopholes. Nevertheless, the underlying difficulties, such as limited land and poor footing, were presumably always similar. Still, possibly the living history folks, who have already tried something like this, can speak more about it. It's also fascinating to observe that both the longbow and the crossbow hit their limits when the enemy is quite close. In Todd's test, neither the archer nor the crossbowman could hit a target closer than 15 millers to the tower without leaning over the battlements, which is probably not what you want to do if the opponent is shooting back. So, if a fortress had no jutting towers along its walls to shoot from, the defenders had to resort to projectiles that could be fired more steeply downward, like javelins, stones, pieces of wood, etc. However, Hardy and Strickland showed that loopholes were often intended for specific weapons. For example, the kings of England, who, as we indicated earlier, relied on the crossbow as their principal defensive weapon in the 13th century, built and extended their castles so they could best be defended with the crossbow. This obviously gives an advantage to the weapon the defenses were intended for. But solely by its design alone, the crossbow arguably had less of an edge over the longbow in castle defense than one might expect. At the beginning, I mentioned that this movie is a thought exercise, right? Well, here's another one for you. How would you recreate civilization if it were to collapse? Given the current geopolitical context, it's not entirely out of the question, is it? If that were to happen, you'd need to know how to purify water, create a wolf pen to safeguard your livestock from wild predators, and maybe even figure out how to manufacture penicillin, gunpowder, and soap. Crossbow. Weapon of the marksman? Filmmakers enjoy the moments when soldiers passionately charge a wall, palisades go up in flames, and the air is filled with arrows and bolts. In truth, such assaults were quite rare, e.g., they were scarce for the same reasons filmmakers appreciate them. They are chaotic, dangerous, and risky. One explanation for this is that the attackers had to reveal themselves to the defenders' bolts and arrows, who tried to stop the invasion. In such a case, when numerous adversaries came at once, the longbow's increased rate of fire was certainly an edge, although it remains to be revealed just how much faster an archer could shot under these circumstances. Wouldn't that be an experiment for you, Todd and Joe? During a blockade, which made up a considerable deal of most sieges, archers and crossbowmen had various jobs. Their major purpose was to prevent the adversary from freely approaching the fortress by shooting at targeted individuals. In a sense, they served as marksmen, seeking to remove enemy patrols, scouts, or anybody else who dared to leave cover. When this suppressive fire works, sometimes just a small company of archers might hold a stronghold. For example, around 1404, 28 English crossbowmen successfully defended Caernarfon Castle against the superior force of the Welsh rebel Owain Glyndwr. During a blockade, which may extend for weeks or perhaps months, it was probably not desirable to shoot a lot of arrows or bolts in a short space of time, as there was usually only a limited number. Archers and crossbowmen would, thus, probably have sought to inflict as much harm as possible with as few projectiles as feasible. This is why scouts, engineers, and high-ranking persons were sought-after targets. The most noteworthy example is undoubtedly Richard the Lionheart, who was killed by a crossbow bolt during the siege of Chaluz Castle in 1199. However, this probably didn't happen exactly like in Ridley Scott's movie Robin Hood, but because the moment is so epic, we'll present it to you anyway. Aerople j'ai tué le roi. Regardez, j'ai tué le roi. With this sort of shooting, reacting rapidly and shooting accurately could be a significant benefit. This brings us to the second argument, specifically that the crossbow was more suited to accurate, reactive shooting because it could be held loaded, and was ready anytime a good shot presented itself. A longbow, in contrast, can't be held loaded since it gets damage if it's kept on full draw for too long. Instead, it has to be drawn right before shooting. It is vital to remember that we're talking about warbows here, some of which had a draw weight of well over 100 pounds and can't just be drawn like the good old toy bow at summer camp. To shoot these warbows, archers need on a certain technique with a complex series of motions that can't be modified at will. But this reasoning is not totally right either. Certain crossbows can be maintained loaded for a while, notably those with steel laths or prods, which is the bow component of the crossbow. But the point is, steel prods only really became common in the 14th century. Before then, most crossbows featured wooden or composite prods, and wooden prods were frequently manufactured from the same woods as longbows, either yew or ash. Hence, it is possible that wooden prods also took damage if they were held loaded for too long. The crossbowmen obviously didn't have to shoot instantly, like an archer did. Still, taking a loaded crossbow on an hour-long patrol was probably not a good idea. Composite prods consisting of wood, horn, and sinew were more expensive than wooden ones, but they were also stronger. This meant they could probably handle the tension a little longer without incurring harm. But as far as we know, no tests have been done on this. We don't advocate trying this out with your historically accurate reconstructed crossbow, but please comment below if you have any such experiences. Nevertheless, a crossbowman may prepare a crossbow and keep it loaded, even if it was only for 30 seconds or so. This would allow him to react more rapidly and lessen the time he required to expose himself when shooting. In comparison, because of the sequence of actions an archer had to perform, he could only prepare in cover to a restricted degree before stepping forward to shoot, whereas the crossbowman may remain in cover until fully ready. This gets us to the third point, that in a siege, the most major disadvantage of the crossbow was mitigated: its slow reload time. Neutralized disadvantages? One of the main drawbacks of the crossbow was that it took longer to load because it usually required a tool, for example, a winch or lever. As a result, its maximum rate of fire was significantly lower than that of the longbow. Todd, for instance, can't shoot 2 bolts with his 860 Watt crossbow in the time Joe Gibbs delivers 6 shots flying with his 160 Watt longbow. In another test, even a simple hand-spanned crossbow with only 130 lost the race against a 130 Watt longbow. It is a topic of contention how significant the pace of fire engaged in a combat, but the high reload time would have surely been a difficulty for crossbowmen because they were virtually unprotected when they were busy with their winch or lever. This deficit would certainly have been mitigated if the crossbowman stayed in one location and had substantial shelter. A wall or protective screen would have allowed him to reload while beneath cover. You simply need to step toward the embrasures or loopholes to shoot. Also, during sieges, many people, women and youths for example, did not fight but supported the combatants. With their support, a crossbowman could shoot with 2 or 3 crossbows. But even if he was on his lonesome, the chance to reload in cover would have been a big aid. As we have seen, the principal responsibility of the defender's archers was to ensure that the enemy could only enter a specific radius of the fortress at the risk of their life and hence had to stay a distance. The major goal of the attacker's archers was to ensure that the defenders could not carry out this task uninterrupted. Therefore, the two sides strove for fire superiority to achieve freedom of movement. Their goal was not necessarily to shoot as swiftly as possible or hit with every shot, but to force the adversary into cover by keeping up a consistent firing rate. Due to the risk fear being hit, the attackers had to take caution near the castle and set up their siege camp at a safe distance from the defenders. In this circumstance, range mattered significantly more than precision and piercing power. For the defenders, this meant that the longer the range of their weaponry, the further away they could keep the enemy. Crucially, the defenders possessed the advantage of a lofty posture, which increased the range of their archers. Joe, for example, fired 24 mm further from the 18 mm high Pope's Tower than from the ground, ENF, and in an experiment by Professor Anna Crowley, archers shot a full 100 mm farther when they were 12 millers above ground level. INF. Although war crossbows normally have a substantially higher draw weight than longbows, they convey less potential energy to the bolt. They have a great penetrating power at short range, but a shorter maximum range. For example, in this test, a longbow with a 110 mph draw weight having almost a third more range than a crossbow with a 130 mph draw weight. So, when it came to keeping the opponent at a distance, the longbow seemed to have the edge. But this would have been mitigated, at least partially, by the fact that the attackers needed to approach pretty close to the fortress to reliably hit the defenders. Tests in 4 castles in France have showed that an archer's likelihood of striking a loophole at a distance of 40 millers was merely 2%, which grew to roughly 33% from 15 millers. Of course, this is largely reliant on the talents of the archer and the sort of loophole. Still, the experiment clearly indicates that having a chance of hitting a defender required getting fairly near to a fortification. So, back to the major question. Was the crossbow superior as a siege weapon? Both weapons had benefits and drawbacks, and were utilized in battles and sieges. Which one was used would have hinged first and foremost on availability. We do not assume that one weapon was inherently more suited to sieges, but we'd love to hear your ideas, arguments, and suggestions.